The colony of New Avalon was supposed to be a beacon of human progress, a thriving settlement on the edge of the galaxy. It had taken decades of effort, billions of credits, and the sacrifice of countless pioneers to establish. A symbol that humanity was no longer confined to the cradle of Earth. And then, in a single day, it was gone. The distress signal had been brief. A garbled message intercepted by a passing trade vessel before silence swallowed the colony whole. No survivors, no wreckage, just an empty, lifeless planet where a thriving city had once stood. The attackers had left nothing behind. No declaration, no warning, not even a name. They had simply erased New Avalon as if it had never existed. But humanity remembered. And humanity did not forgive. Admiral Jonathan Graves stood on the bridge of the UNS Retribution, staring at the tactical display in front of him. It was a monstrous sight, a fleet unlike anything in human history, assembled for one single purpose: revenge. 700,000 warships, the combined might of every Terran fleet, every colonial navy, every mercenary outfit willing to take up arms. From the smallest corvette to the behemoth dreadnoughts, the fleet was an unstoppable armada that stretched across the void like an angry storm. For the first time, humanity was united, not for politics, not for trade, not even for survival, for vengeance. "ETA to enemy system?" Graves asked. "4 days, Admiral." His XO, Commander Vasquez, turned to him with a grim nod. "Scout drones confirmed their presence. We know who did it." Graves exhaled sharply. "Who?" Vasquez's jaw tightened. "They call themselves the Zorvax Dominion, some kind of ancient warrior empire. We weren't even on their radar before. They probably thought we were just another minor race, easy prey." A growl rumbled through the bridge crew. The Zorvax had made a fatal mistake. Graves turned to the massive viewport, gazing at the endless fleet surrounding his flagship. They thought wrong. The Zorvax were old. Their empire had existed for thousands of years, built on conquest and dominance. They had crushed dozens of species, burned hundreds of worlds, and fought wars before humanity had even discovered fire. But for the first time in millennia, they had made a miscalculation. The humans were not like the others. They did not cower. They did not beg. They brought war. 700,000 human warships arrived in Zorvax space in a wall of fire and steel. The first planetary defense stations barely had time to raise shields before nuclear hellfire reduced them to molten slag. Their fleets scrambled, commanders barking orders in panic. They had expected a skirmish, maybe a minor retaliatory raid. Instead, they were met with annihilation. Missiles streaked across the void in the millions. Kinetic slugs shattered battleships with ease, and when the human Marines landed, they did not take prisoners. One by one, the Zorvax colonies fell. The once proud Dominion, which had stood for thousands of years, began to crumble under the sheer, unrelenting force of human rage. There were no negotiations, no peace talks, only vengeance, and humanity was just getting started. The Zorvax High Council had never known fear. For centuries, they had ruled through terror, their warriors unmatched, their fleets unstoppable. But now, for the first time in their long, brutal history, they understood what it meant to be prey. Reports flooded in from across the Dominion. The humans had arrived in force. Their warships, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, moved with relentless efficiency, burning through every defensive line the Zorvax had thrown in their path. Planets that had stood under the Dominion's rule for millennia were now reduced to smoldering wastelands. On the bridge of the UNS Retribution, Admiral Graves listened to the latest battle reports. "Sir, enemy stronghold on Varlock 7 neutralized. Resistance was heavier than expected, but ground forces secured the capital within 6 hours." Graves nodded. "Casualties?" The tactical officer hesitated. Minimal, sir. Less than 1,000 dead. 1,000 dead would have been a tragedy in any other war, but not this one. Not after what had happened to New Avalon. Graves turned his attention to the holographic map of Zorvak's space. In just 2 weeks, a third of their empire had been reduced to ruin. Admiral, Vasquez said, her voice tight, we've intercepted Zorvak's transmissions. They're calling for reinforcements from their core systems. They're preparing for a last stand. Graves allowed himself a grim smile. Good, he said. Let them come. On the Zorvak's homeworld of Cathara, Supreme Warlord Zolvir watched as his empire crumbled. The humans had moved faster than he thought possible. They did not just fight. They destroyed. Entire fleets wiped out in hours, fortress worlds reduced to ash. The humans had no interest in diplomacy, no hesitation, no mercy. A desperate council member spoke up. We must surrender. Offer them whatever they want. Zolvir bared his fangs. They do not want surrender. His voice was cold, final. They want revenge. Another counselor shuddered. Then what do we do? The warlord closed his eyes. He had studied the humans, underestimated them. He had assumed them weak, as so many other empires had. But now, as their ships darkened his skies, he understood the truth. The humans were monsters, and there was no stopping them. The Zorvak's dominion was dying. Once, its fleets had ruled unchallenged, spreading across the galaxy like a plague, crushing species that dared to resist. But now, that same dominion burned. From the bridge of the UNS Retribution, Admiral Graves watched the unfolding battle over the Zorvak's homeworld, Cathara. The holographic display flickered as fleet movements updated in real time. The human armada had arrived in full force, hundreds of thousands of warships forming an unbreakable wall in space. The Zorvak's fleet was vast, but they were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and worst of all, outmatched in sheer human fury. Enemy forces engaging, Commander Vasquez reported. They're throwing everything they have at us. Graves didn't blink. And Vasquez's lips curled into a grim smirk. They're dying fast. The battle was brutal, but the outcome had been decided long before the first shots were fired. The Zorvaks, for all their age and experience, had never faced anything like humanity before. Human warships didn't hold formation like the other species the Zorvaks had conquered. They didn't follow rigid tactics, didn't break under pressure. They adapted, they overwhelmed, and they fought with a kind of viciousness that terrified even the most seasoned Zorvak's warriors. Tactical nukes streaked through the void, detonating in the heart of enemy formations. Kinetic slugs, traveling at near light speeds, punched through battleships, turning them into shredded wreckage. Swarms of fighter drones overwhelmed carriers, cutting through shields like razors. The Zorvaks fought desperately, their homeworld at stake, but it was not enough. Admiral, the enemy flagship is in range, a lieutenant called out. Graves didn't hesitate. Fire! The Retribution's main cannon, a mass driver the size of a skyscraper, roared to life. A tungsten round the size of a shuttle was launched at near relativistic speeds, smashing into the Zorvak's command ship before its shields could react. The vessel disintegrated instantly. A cheer erupted from the bridge, but Graves remained unmoved. Status on planetary defenses? Surface cannons are still active, sir, Vasquez said, but they're losing power fast. Our bombardment is breaking them apart. Graves nodded. Then we move to the next phase. On the surface of Cathara, Supreme Warlord Zolvir watched in horror as the sky turned to fire. Humanity's bombardment had begun. High above, the human fleet rained destruction upon his world. Cities that had stood for thousands of years were turned to rubble in seconds. Entire mountain ranges shattered under orbital strikes. The oceans boiled as warships unleashed their fury. The Zorvax had waged war for centuries, had committed genocide on dozens of species. They had believed themselves unstoppable. But now, as their own world was torn apart, they knew fear. A transmission flickered on the warlord's command screen. A human face appeared, Admiral Graves. His expression was unreadable. "This is what happens when you cross humanity," Graves said, his voice like cold steel. "You wiped out our colony. You thought you could erase us." He leaned closer to the screen. "Now, we erase you." Zolvir swallowed his pride. He had never begged before. But now he had no choice. "Human," he growled, lowering his head slightly. "We surrender." There was a long silence. Then Graves spoke. "No." The transmission cut out. A moment later, the sky split apart as the final bombardment began. Cathara burned. The war was over, and humanity had won. The war was over, but the rage still burned. Cathara had been reduced to a husk. Its once proud cities turned to mountains of ash and rubble. The oceans still boiled from orbital bombardments, and the air was thick with smoke and the scent of death. Fires raged across the shattered landscape, consuming the remains of a once great civilization. Admiral Graves stood in the command deck of the UNS Retribution, staring at the ruined world below. The Zorvax dominion had fallen. Their fleets were destroyed, their armies crushed, their people left broken. And yet, he felt no satisfaction. "They're sending surrender requests from across their remaining colonies," Commander Vasquez reported. "Every Zorvax world left standing is begging for terms." Graves exhaled slowly. He had known this would happen. The Zorvax had believed themselves invincible, but when faced with total annihilation, their will had shattered. The same species that had enslaved, massacred, and conquered countless others were now pleading for mercy. "They're offering reparations," Vasquez continued. "They're promising to disarm, to disband their empire completely." Graves said nothing for a long moment. Outside the viewport, the last human dropships were finishing their sweeps of Cathara. The ground war had been a slaughter. The Zorvax defenders had fought, but with no fleet to support them, it had been hopeless. Human Marines had torn through their last bastions of resistance, executing every military leader they could find. "Their race deserves extinction," a voice growled behind him. Graves turned to see General Marcus O'Neill, the commander of the ground forces. His armor was still stained with Zorvax blood, his expression cold with fury. "They got what they deserved," Graves said evenly. "Did they?" O'Neill stepped forward. "One of their warriors told me something before I put a bullet in his skull. He said the Zorvax don't even have a word for surrender, that they've never lost a war." His lip curled. "Until now." Graves nodded. He had no pity for the Zorvax. They had brought this upon themselves. "What do we do now, Admiral?" Vasquez asked. Graves turned back to the viewport. The Zorvax homeworld was dying, but there were still survivors, civilians, families, those who had never held a weapon. The question was whether they deserved to live. For New Avalon, the answer should have been simple, but he hesitated. "Send a message to the fleet," he said at last. "The war is over. No more killing." Vasquez and O'Neill both stiffened in surprise. "You're letting them live?" O'Neill asked, his voice sharp. Graves turned, his expression hard. "We came for vengeance," he said. "We got it. Now we leave." O'Neill exhaled through his nose but didn't argue. Vasquez gave a small nod of understanding. "Order sent," she said. The fleet began to withdraw. The remaining Zorvax, those too weak to fight or too broken to resist, watched in stunned silence as the human armada vanished into the void. They had been defeated so completely that their very survival now depended on the mercy of the species they had once sought to erase. Humanity had won. But Graves knew that somewhere, sometime, another enemy would rise. And when they did, humanity would be ready. The Zorvak's dominion was no more. What remained of their civilization was little more than scattered ruins and broken survivors, their once mighty fleets reduced to drifting wreckage in the void. Across their former empire, human warships loomed like specters, ensuring that no remnants of their military would ever rise again. But even in defeat, the Zorvaks endured. Admiral Graves knew this war had not just been about revenge. It had been about making a statement. Humanity would never again be prey. And the galaxy had heard the message loud and clear. 6 months after the fall of Cathara, the echoes of war still rippled across the stars. Humanity had changed. The United Terran Directorate had become something different, stronger, more unified, but also more feared. The sight of a Terran warship was now enough to make entire planets reconsider their allegiances. Diplomats from every corner of known space scrambled to establish treaties, alliances, or at least guarantees that they would never cross humanity. But there were those who whispered that humanity had become something dangerous. The war had been justified. Every species that had suffered under Zorvak's rule had celebrated their fall. But there was an unspoken fear now. If humanity could destroy a millennia-old empire in mere months, what would they do to anyone who stood in their way? On Earth, the streets of every major city were filled with celebrations. Statues were erected to honor the fallen of New Avalon. Veterans of the war were hailed as heroes. Every broadcast, every news outlet, every speech made it clear. Humanity had won, and it had secured its place in the galaxy. But behind the victory parades, the war had left its scars. Graves had seen it in the soldiers who had fought on Cathara, the coldness in their eyes, the way they spoke of the Zorvaks as if they were not even sentient. The war had not just wiped out an empire, it had hardened humanity itself. And perhaps that was necessary. Standing in his office on the newly commissioned UNS Eternity, Graves studied a classified report. Intelligence had confirmed what he had already suspected. Not everyone in the galaxy had been terrified by humanity's war of vengeance. Some had been watching, calculating. A new power had begun to stir on the fringes of known space. An alliance of species, once rivals, now united by one thing: fear of humanity. They had seen what humanity was capable of, and they had decided they could not afford to wait. They were preparing for war. Graves closed the file. The Zorvaks had been the first, but they would not be the last, and if the galaxy wanted to test humanity again, it would burn just the same. The galaxy had not forgotten. 6 months after the fall of the Zorvak's dominion, humanity stood unmatched. Its fleets were the most feared in the known universe, its soldiers hardened by war. Every species that had once dismissed humanity as insignificant now watched them with wary eyes. But not all of them watched in silence. A storm was coming. Admiral Graves sat in the war room of the UNS Eternity, the new flagship of the United Terran Directorate. Around him, holographic projections displayed intelligence reports gathered from the edges of known space. The signs were unmistakable. "They call themselves the Accord of Sovereign Worlds," Vasquez reported, her voice clipped. 5 species, once enemies, now allied under one purpose: containing humanity. Graves exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the projection. The Accord wasn't just a political pact. It was an emergency coalition formed by species who had never trusted each other, who had fought wars against one another for centuries. Now, They had put aside their hatred. Because they feared something more. They feared humanity. O'Neill, seated across the table, let out a low chuckle. 5 species banding together just to stop little old us? I'd say that's flattering. No, Graves said, voice steady. That's dangerous. The Zorvacs had been powerful, but they had been alone. Isolated. Arrogant. The Accord was different. It was coordinated. Intelligent. And it had one goal: to make sure humanity never again wielded the kind of power it had used to wipe out the Zorvacs. They're already moving, Vasquez continued. They've reinforced border systems, doubled their fleets. We intercepted communications confirming joint military exercises. They're preparing for war. Graves leaned back, his fingers steepled. The war with the Zorvacs had been swift, brutal. But this? This would be something else entirely. He turned to O'Neill. What's the status of our forces? The general smirked. Stronger than ever. New Avalon's destruction woke something up in us, Admiral. Recruitment rates are at an all-time high. Every colony is churning out warships and weapons like their lives depend on it. His expression darkened. Because they do. Graves nodded. Humanity had won its war of vengeance, but the price had been transformation. They were no longer the species that had once sought peace among the stars. They were now something far more dangerous. We need to strike first, Vasquez said firmly. We can't let them box us in. Graves didn't answer immediately. He stared at the galactic map, the cold vastness of space filled with the colors of hostile factions. The Accord thought they could contain humanity, thought they could put a leash on the species that had just wiped an empire from existence. They were wrong. Slowly, Graves stood. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Prepare the fleets. Vasquez and O'Neill exchanged a glance. We're going to war? O'Neill asked, though there was no hesitation in his voice. Graves's eyes were like steel. We never stopped. The galaxy had drawn its lines, and now humanity would teach them what it meant to cross them. The galaxy stood on the edge of war. The Accord of Sovereign Worlds had united 5 powerful species, sworn enemies now bound by a single cause, containing humanity before it became unstoppable. They reinforced their borders, mass-produced warships, and stockpiled weapons. They thought they could intimidate humanity into submission. They were wrong. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the UNS Eternity, humanity's most advanced warship, staring at the tactical display. A line of red markers stretched across the galactic map, Accord fleets stationed along every major hyperlane leading into human space. The blockade was nearly complete. A warning, a challenge. Graves didn't hesitate. All fleets prepare for engagement. The officers around him didn't question the order. There was no debate. The time for diplomacy had passed the moment the Accord declared humanity a threat. Now, there was only one response. War. The UNS Eternity led the charge. In the Seldari system, the Accord's fleet commander, High Warden Threx, watched his scanners as thousands of human warships exited hyperspace. Impossible, he muttered. He had expected a slow build-up, negotiations, the usual hesitation that came before war. But humanity hadn't waited. They had launched their attack without warning. Alarms blared across the command deck. The human fleet was already deploying fighter swarms and targeting Accord capital ships. Energy spikes signaled the charging of railguns and mass drivers. Humanity hadn't come to posture. They had come to kill. Raise shields! All weapons fire! Threx roared. But it was too late. The first battle of the war lasted less than an hour. The Accord fleet was shattered. What had been intended as an impenetrable blockade became a massacre. The UNS Eternity alone had annihilated 3 battleships with precision orbital strikes. Kinetic rounds, traveling at near-light speeds, tore through enemy hulls as if they were made of paper. The survivors fled. The message was clear. Humanity would not be contained. The news spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, species watched in stunned silence as human forces pushed forward, smashing through the Accord's defenses with ruthless efficiency. On the Accord's council world of Vandros Prime, the ruling species gathered in a desperate emergency session. Holograms flickered with footage of human warships carving through their fleets, soldiers in advanced power armor storming planetary defenses. "They don't fight like the Zorvax," a Kavir diplomat hissed. "They don't hold formations, they don't retreat, they don't hesitate." A Gathari warlord slammed his fist against the table. "Then we need to strike harder. We outnumber them 5-1. A solemn voice cut through the argument. "It doesn't matter." All eyes turned to the Seldari representative. His species had fought humanity at the Seldari system. They had seen what the others had not. "They fight like they've already won," he said. Silence fell over the chamber. The war had only just begun. And already, the Accord was afraid. On the bridge of the Eternity, Graves watched as his fleets spread like wildfire. Planets fell, enemy fleets were obliterated, and the Accord's lines crumbled faster than anyone had predicted. But he knew this was only the beginning. They would regroup. They would strike back. Good. Let them try. Graves turned to Vasquez. "Prepare the next assault. We take the Kavir stronghold next." Vasquez nodded. "And after that?" Graves's lips curled into a cold smile. "We don't stop until they beg for mercy." The war had begun, and humanity would finish it. The Accord was reeling. What was supposed to be a containment effort had turned into an unrelenting nightmare. Human warships had torn through the Seldari system, leaving behind only wreckage and death. The outer defenses of the Accord had been shattered in days, not months, and now the United Terran Directorate was pushing deeper into enemy space. Admiral Graves stood at the heart of it all, watching as the greatest military machine humanity had ever built ground its enemies to dust. The Kavir stronghold was next. An ancient race, the Kavir had once been warlords who dominated entire sectors. Their homeworld, Vandros 9, was a fortress, protected by planetary shields, automated defense turrets, and a fleet stationed in permanent orbit. It was considered an impenetrable bastion. Humanity didn't care. The UNS Eternity led the charge, backed by the 2nd and 5th Expeditionary Fleets. 7,000 warships, more than the Zorvax had ever faced at once, surged forward. They emerged from hyperspace in a perfect formation, their arrival accompanied by the deafening silence of the void, just before hell erupted. Kavir warships launched interceptors and missile swarms. Energy cannons powered up, and planetary defense systems locked onto human vessels. The battlefield became a swirling storm of plasma fire, railgun rounds, and detonations as both sides clashed. But the humans had come prepared. Tactical A. I synchronized the fleet's movements with near-perfect precision. Capital ships laid down devastating suppressive fire, while smaller strike groups weaved through the chaos, cutting through Kavir defenses like blades through flesh. The UNS Eternity deployed its Dreadnought-class railguns, each round traveling at near-light speed, obliterating enemy ships in single shots. On the bridge, Graves watched the chaos unfold. "Planetary shields are holding," Vasquez reported. "We'll need ground forces to breach." Graves nodded. "Deploy the Marines." The order sent thousands of drop pods screaming through Vandros 9's atmosphere. The planetary shields, weakened by the orbital bombardment, flickered as the first wave broke through. Then the real battle began. General O'Neill led the charge. Clad in advanced power armor, wielding a high-caliber plasma rifle, He and his troops stormed the capital city of Luthos Prime. The Kavir had deployed thousands of ground troops, their towering war machines lumbering through the streets, firing barrages of plasma fire. But human soldiers weren't just warriors. They were killers. O'Neill's men moved in tight, efficient squads. Drones scouted enemy positions, feeding real-time data to combat HUDs. Grenades arced over cover, EMP bursts disabled enemy mechs, and sniper teams eliminated Kavir officers with terrifying precision. A massive Kavir walker turned the corner, its heavy cannons glowing. O'Neill didn't hesitate. He raised his wrist, marking the target with a simple voice command. "Valkyrie strike, Sector 3B." From above, a hypersonic human aircraft screamed downward, releasing a payload of tungsten rods. The projectiles, accelerated to near-terminal velocity, struck the walker like meteors, reducing it to molten slag. O'Neill grinned. "Push forward." The battle raged for hours. Streets burned, buildings crumbled, and the once mighty Kavir warriors fell one by one. They had expected a siege. Instead, they got an execution. By nightfall, the Kavir government was in ruins. Vandross 9, once a stronghold, was now just another human conquest. O'Neill stood atop the shattered remains of the Kavir command center, raising the Terran banner as his troops cheered. Humanity had claimed another world. On the bridge of the Eternity, Graves listened to the victory reports in silence. The Accord was losing. Fast. Vasquez exhaled. "They never had a chance?" Graves didn't smile. "They still think they do," he said, "and that makes them dangerous." Vasquez frowned. "You think they'll retaliate?" Graves nodded. "They have no choice. Their only hope is a counterattack before we steamroll them completely." O'Neill's voice crackled over the comm. "What's next, Admiral?" Graves stared at the galactic map, his eyes locked on the next major Accord stronghold. "We keep going." The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The Accord was desperate. Humanity had turned their containment effort into a full-scale slaughter, sweeping through star systems with unrelenting force. The fall of Vandross 9 sent shockwaves through the galactic community. What was once a mighty Kavir stronghold had been reduced to rubble in mere days. Now every species in the Accord knew one thing for certain: if they didn't stop humanity now, they never would. And so they planned their counterstrike. Deep within the Accord's central command station on Zal-Ra Prime, the leaders of the 5-member coalition gathered. Holograms of burning cities and shattered fleets played around them, the brutal efficiency of humanity's war machine undeniable. "This cannot continue," Warlord Jekthar of the Kavir snarled, his claws flexing against the conference table. "They have no mercy, no restraint. If we hesitate, they will burn our homeworlds next." The Gathari diplomat, Vrexal, hissed in agreement. "We underestimated them. We assumed they would fight with hesitation, with politics in mind." His eyes flickered with an eerie glow. "Instead, they fight like they were born for this." The Seldari representative, one of the few survivors from the first engagement, looked grim. "We must strike at their heart. Not skirmishes, not battles. A killing blow." The room fell silent. They all knew what he meant. Earth. The Accord's plan was simple: strike where humanity was most vulnerable. Their fleets were powerful, their armies unstoppable. But Earth? Earth was their home, their legacy, their pride. If the Accord could burn Earth, they could break humanity's will to fight. They assembled a fleet unlike anything seen before, over 20,000 warships, crewed by the best soldiers and tacticians their species had to offer. Every last resource was poured into this mission. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance they had. And so they launched their assault. On the bridge of the UNS Eternity, Admiral Graves stood motionless, eyes fixed on the tactical display. Red markers, thousands of them, swarmed toward Earth, the largest enemy fleet humanity had ever faced. The room was dead silent. Even Vasquez, usually unshaken, paled at the sight. "They're going for Earth," she whispered. O'Neill's voice came through the comms, cold and sharp. "They want to break us." Graves exhaled slowly, then turned to his officers. His voice carried through the bridge with unshakable resolve. "Then let's teach them what happens when you back humanity into a corner." The Battle of Earth would be remembered for millennia. The Accord fleet exited hyperspace just beyond the Sol system, weapons primed, expecting to find Earth vulnerable. Instead, they found the largest human armada ever assembled. 700,000 warships. Every Terran fleet had been recalled. Every colony had sent reinforcements. Every last resource humanity could muster had been funneled into this moment. The Accord expected a battle. What they got was an extinction event. The void between the fleets turned into a hellscape of fire and destruction. Human dreadnoughts unleashed railgun rounds the size of city buses, tearing through enemy ships like paper. Swarms of Terran fighter craft moved with coordinated precision, executing complex maneuvers that shattered enemy formations. The Eternity spearheaded the assault, its experimental weapon systems cutting through the largest Accord warships with ease. Plasma lances seared through hulls, while kinetic slugs turned battlecruisers into drifting debris. The Accord fought back with everything they had. Their warships outnumbered humanity's, but numbers didn't matter anymore. Humanity had been fighting this war for survival from the moment New Avalon burned. They had been reforged in blood and fire. And now, they were unstoppable. On the Accord command ship, panic spread. "They're overwhelming us," a Seldari officer cried out. "We can't—" A kinetic round slammed through the command deck, tearing half the ship apart in an instant. Explosions rippled through the fleet as ship after ship was obliterated. Admiral Graves watched it all unfold, eyes cold, voice steady. "Show them no mercy." The battle lasted 12 hours. By the end, the Accord fleet was gone. 20,000 warships had entered Sol. None had survived. Humanity had won. The Accord had gambled everything and lost. Their military was broken, their leadership shattered. The survivors fled, their coalition in ruins. On Earth, billions of humans cheered. Across the stars, colonies rejoiced. But on the bridge of the Eternity, Admiral Graves wasn't celebrating. He knew what came next. This war wasn't over. It was time to take the fight to them. Humanity would not be contained. Humanity would rule. The war was no longer about survival. Humanity had crushed the Accord's attempt to wipe out Earth. Their 20,000 ship armada had been annihilated, their fleets shattered, their military left in ruins. But Admiral Graves knew one truth about war. If you left the enemy alive, they would return. And humanity did not believe in second chances. Now, it was time for vengeance. The invasion of the Accord's core worlds began with brutal efficiency. Humanity launched a campaign that spanned entire star systems. Every fleet, every warship, every soldier that Earth could spare was mobilized. The days of defending human space were over. Now, humanity was bringing the war to the Accord's doorstep. The first target, the Gathari homeworld. The planet Xiphos 4 was a technological marvel. Massive orbital stations, planetary defense grids, and an artificial ring around the planet that housed most of their industrial power. It had stood untouched for centuries. No enemy had ever breached its defenses. Then humanity arrived. 700,000 warships had gathered in Earth's defense. Now they moved outward like a vengeful storm, sweeping through space, leaving nothing but debris behind. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the eternity, watching the planet loom closer. A cold fury burned in his chest. He had lost friends. He had watched the Accord massacre human colonies, had seen innocent families burned from orbit. Now, it was their turn to suffer. "All ships," Graves said, his voice like steel. "Commence bombardment." The sky above Xiphos 4 burned. Human dreadnoughts unleashed tungsten rods the size of skyscrapers, each one slamming into the surface with the force of a nuclear detonation. Plasma lances cut through orbital stations, sending fire and wreckage spiraling toward the planet below. Githari warships scrambled to defend their home, but they were already too late. Human fighter squadrons weaved through their defenses, precision striking shield generators and key infrastructure. Special forces teams deployed onto the surface, assassinating high-value targets before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The Githari had once prided themselves on their tactical superiority. Now, they were running for their lives. General O'Neill led the ground assault. As the first waves of dropships broke through the planet's atmosphere, anti-air defenses opened fire, filling the sky with plasma bolts. Some human ships were hit, spiraling into the cityscape below, but most made it through. O'Neill and his men landed in the middle of the Githari capital. The city was already in chaos. Fires raged through towering skyscrapers. The streets were filled with terrified civilians, scrambling for cover as human mechs marched through the rubble. The Githari military tried to push back. Their shock troopers, clad in advanced battle armor, engaged the human marines in brutal street-to-street combat. Energy weapons flared, explosions ripped through buildings, and screams echoed through the burning ruins. But the humans had come prepared. Sniper teams eliminated Githari officers before they could issue orders. Drone swarms overloaded enemy targeting systems. EMP strikes disabled their tanks, leaving them vulnerable to devastating missile barrages. O'Neill's team moved fast, cutting through enemy resistance like a scalpel. As they pushed toward the Githari command center, he activated his comm. "Admiral, the capital's defenses are collapsing. The enemy is in full retreat." Graves's voice came through, cold and merciless. "Then finish it!" O'Neill did not hesitate. He raised his plasma rifle and led his men forward. By nightfall, Xiphos 4 belonged to humanity. The Githari government had been executed. The remaining military forces surrendered. And those who didn't? They were wiped out. Across the planet, human forces secured control. Their flag was raised above the ruins of the capital, a grim reminder that humanity did not forgive. The Accord had thought they could exterminate humans. Instead, they had sealed their own fate. Admiral Graves stood on the bridge of the eternity, watching the burning planet below. Vasquez exhaled. "That's 2 core worlds down." O'Neill's voice came through the comm again. "The Githari are done. What's next?" Graves didn't even blink. "The Seldari homeworld." Vasquez's eyes flickered with dark amusement. "We're not stopping, are we?" Graves turned toward the galactic map, showing the remaining Accord worlds. His jaw tightened. "They wanted a war," he said, voice low, dangerous. "Now, we give them one." The conquest of the Accord had begun, and humanity would not stop until the galaxy was theirs. The Seldari homeworld of Vahzir was the jewel of the Accord. It was a planet of towering crystalline spires, floating citadels, and lush bioluminescent forests that stretched for miles. Unlike the industrial worlds of the Githari or the war-forged fortresses of the Kavir, Vahzir was a place of peace, art, and diplomacy. It had never seen war on its surface. Until now. Admiral Graves stared at the holographic projection of the planet. Even from orbit, Vahzir was breathtaking, its twin moons casting a pale glow over the sapphire oceans. He almost felt bad for what was about to happen. Almost. The Seldari were the ones who started this war, Vasquez muttered, standing beside him. They whispered in the ears of the other species, pushed them to attack our colonies. Now look where it got them. Graves didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his officers. Deploy the fleet. 700,000 warships burned through the void, their engines leaving trails of fire as they descended upon Vazir. Seldari defense stations scrambled to react, their fleet mobilizing in a desperate attempt to repel the invasion. Their warships were sleek, elegant, built for precision strikes rather than brute force. They had been designed to win through diplomacy, through superior tactics, through carefully calculated engagements. They had never fought an enemy like humanity. The first exchange lasted minutes. The Seldari fleet opened fire, unleashing energy lances that cut through space with pinpoint accuracy. Human dreadnoughts responded with brutal efficiency. Railguns the size of skyscrapers fired hypersonic rounds that tore through shields, slicing ships in half before their crews could even react. Missiles swarmed through the battlefield, artificial intelligence guiding them past countermeasures, slamming into hulls with devastating force. The Seldari fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against overwhelming firepower. In less than an hour, their navy was gone. Planetary defenses activated. Vazir's surface was protected by a shield network designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The Seldari had believed it was impenetrable, an absolute safeguard against any invasion. They were wrong. Humanity had already faced these kinds of defenses in past battles. They had learned. They had adapted. A fleet of stealth bombers slipped past the outer defenses, deploying specialized payloads designed to overload shield harmonics. The moment the energy field flickered, even for a second, human battleships unleashed their full might. Tungsten rods fell from orbit, striking with the force of nuclear warheads. The first impact turned a city into dust. The second cracked the surface of a continent. The shield network collapsed within minutes. The invasion had begun. General O'Neill led the first wave. Dropships descended through the atmosphere, dodging sporadic anti-air fire as they deployed human forces across key strategic points. The Seldari had no standing army. Their soldiers were ceremonial, trained for peacekeeping, not war. They were slaughtered. Mechs the size of buildings marched through the elegant cities, their plasma cannons cutting down whatever resistance remained. Drone swarms blanketed the skies, seeking out and destroying enemy strongholds before they could organize. O'Neill and his Marines pushed through the capital, moving street by street. Seldari civilians screamed in terror as the fighting drew closer. Some tried to run, others begged for mercy. O'Neill gave none. These were the same people who had signed the order to exterminate human colonies. The same people who had watched as Vandros 9 burned, as billions of innocent lives were wiped out. Now, it was their turn. The Seldari Council was holed up in their grand palace, a floating fortress suspended above the capital. It had been their center of power for centuries, a place where they had dictated the fate of countless civilizations. Now, it was nothing more than a target. Human strike teams infiltrated the palace, moving like shadows through its halls. Security forces put up a token resistance, but they were no match for cybernetically enhanced operatives trained for planetary subjugation. Within an hour, the council was dragged from their chambers. O'Neill stood over them, his expression unreadable. The Seldari leader, an elder with shimmering silver skin, looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Please," she whispered, "we surrender." O'Neill tilted his head, as if considering her words. Then he activated his comm. "Admiral Graves, the council is secured. Orders?" There was a long pause. Then Graves's voice came through, cold and final. No survivors. O'Neill nodded. He raised his rifle. The war crimes tribunals would be held later. By humans, for humans. The Seldari Council would not live to see them. By nightfall, Vazir was in flames. The floating citadels fell from the sky. The forests burned. The oceans turned black with ash. And above the planet, the human fleet stood watch. Vasquez let out a breath. That's 3 core worlds down. O'Neill's voice crackled through the comms. The Seldari are finished. What's next? Graves didn't hesitate. The Kavir homeworld. Vasquez grinned. The warriors. Graves's jaw tightened. The last obstacle. The Kavir were different. They were not diplomats. They were not politicians. They were warriors. And if humanity wanted to break the accord completely, they would have to face the deadliest fighters in the galaxy. And win. The war against the accord was nearing its final chapter. The Kavir homeworld, Drakos, stood as the last bastion of their alliance. Unlike the Seldari and Githari, the Kavir did not beg for mercy. They did not surrender. They were warriors bred for battle, a species that had conquered and crushed lesser civilizations for centuries. But they had never faced humanity at its most ruthless. Admiral Graves knew this would be different. Unlike the previous invasions, this would not be a slaughter. The Kavir would fight to the last soldier, to the last breath. There would be no pleas for mercy, no desperate peace offerings. And so, humanity came prepared. The battle for Drakos was the bloodiest of the war. The Kavir fleets did not break upon the first engagement. Their warships were built like fortresses, covered in thick armor plating, bristling with weapons designed for relentless combat. They did not retreat, did not falter. But they did fall. Humanity's fleet moved with surgical precision. Railguns punched through even the thickest hulls, missiles found the cracks in their defenses, and electronic warfare teams scrambled their communications, cutting them off from each other. The fight dragged on for days, but one by one, the Kavir warships were reduced to smoldering wreckage. And then, the invasion began. On the surface, the Kavir made their final stand. Their warriors fought like demons, refusing to give ground, turning every ruined city into a fortress, every street into a battlefield. Even as orbital bombardments shattered their defenses, even as mechs and tanks crushed their lines, they kept fighting. Humanity had never faced an enemy so unyielding. But in the end, it didn't matter. The Kavir had centuries of battle experience, but humanity had something greater: adaptability. They learned, adjusted, countered every tactic thrown at them. What should have been a months-long siege was over in a matter of weeks. The Kavir High Command was wiped out. Their last warriors fell, refusing to surrender. Drakos burned. The accord was no more. Admiral Graves stood aboard the Eternity, watching the ruined surface of the last enemy world. He had thought he would feel something. Relief, triumph, even satisfaction. Instead, there was only silence. Vasquez broke it. "We did it." Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "It's over." Graves exhaled. "No." He turned to the galactic map. The stars stretched out before him, vast and endless. "This was just the beginning." O'Neill's voice crackled over the comms. "We've taken their worlds. What now?" Graves's gaze was cold, unreadable. "We rebuild, expand, secure our place in the galaxy." He looked at the shattered remains of the once mighty accord. "And we make sure no one, no species, ever threatens humanity again." The war was over, but humanity's dominion had just begun.